AWS console, I actually switched my region, so I'm on US East 2 versus US East 1. And the reason I did that is I have some Lambda data already there in US East 1, so I want to start from scratch just like you would start from scratch. So I'm switching over to US East 2 as my region, and then I essentially have a blank console within Lambda. Okay, so I'm logged into the console. I have an administrative account because I want to create a new function, and really what a function is I'm going to write some code, whether it's in Java or .NET or Node or Python, and I'll show you where we can choose the languages. I'm going to write some code that does something, but it's independent of any platform. Like I don't have to worry about like how do I get this on a Windows machine or how do I deploy this to a server or anything like that. My code is going to reside here and Amazon's going to take care of running it for me. Okay, that's the promise of Lambda. A little bit about Lambda in terms of cost. Lambda will allow up to 1 million transactions per month, or 1 million code executions per month. And then basically that 1 million code executions is based on kind of minimal hardware requirements, like how long is my timeout, how much memory is allocated to the function. So what ends up happening is as I allocate more memory to the function, I get less and less requests that belong in that free tier. But we're not going to hit 1 million function calls. So we're in good shape there. So it should be free to use. Okay, so we're in Lambda. The first thing I'm going to do is this big orange button is basically telling me, guiding me through this. I want to create a function. Okay, and I have a couple options that I'm going to choose from. So to start with, we're going to author a function from scratch. If we use the blueprints or browse the serverless app repository, I think those functions are going to be too complicated to start. So I don't want to use those to start, but eventually what ends up happening is there's blueprints that I can choose from, like how do I get an S3 object from using Python? Or how do I create a HTTP endpoint? Or how do I process a DynamoDB stream? Okay, so those blueprints are fairly complicated pieces of code, so I want to start with kind of a hello world application to start with. So that's going to be easier just authoring from scratch. Okay, so at this point we're in Lambda. We click the big orange button, which was to create a function. I have to name my function. My name can be whatever I want, so I'm going to name this MATC Hello World. And then, like I was saying, I don't have a choice of like, is this running on Windows or Linux or whatever, but I do have a choice of which programming language. So I can run .NET, I can run Go, Java, Python, Ruby, older versions of any of those. But I'm going to use the latest and greatest version of Node.js. Okay, because I want to be writing JavaScript. The roles. Okay, so for this class, I know that I want to manage my roles and users and groups from IAM. For this class, I'm skipping that whole part. All I'm going to do is I'm going to say create a new role that has the ability to execute a Lambda function. That's automatically built into Lambda. I don't have to do anything. Ideally, if I know I'm going to build an application that's going to reside on AWS, I'm going to build an account or a group for that application that has the specific permissions to the specific resources that I want. But I'm skipping that for now. The role is just going to have access to Lambda, and that'll automatically get created for me. Okay, and you know enough about IAM. I can go in and search the built-in rules for Lambda. But we're going to create this function, just kind of taking all the default options, other than we had to name it. Takes a second to create the function, but eventually we're going to come to a screen that looks like this. And at the top, we have the designer. We will use the designer, but for today, I think we're probably going to bypass the designer. So I don't even need to look at the designer. What the designer allows us to do is it allows us to basically take incoming data or incoming events and tie those incoming events to our function code. So for instance, I'll just give you an example. Someone uploads a file to an S3 bucket. That can trigger my code to execute. Or someone inserts a record into a Dynamo database. That can trigger my function code. Or someone deletes a record. That can trigger my function code. Okay, so those are the types of events that I'm talking about. Okay, that I can add those triggers. So within the Amazon ecosystem, something happens in some other service, and now as a result of that thing happening in the other service, now I want my function code to execute. An example of that might be, I have a list of users or customers in my Dynamo database, and they say they want to be removed from my customer list. Then I also want to clean up all of their S3 objects, so I don't want to pay for their storage because they're no longer a customer. I might say on that DynamoDB delete, then I'm going to write Lambda code to remove the S3 resources allocated to that user account. That'd be an example of that. Okay, so we don't really need the designer, so we have the triggers, but we're not going to use those for today. Right now, I'm just going to blow up the fonts here so we can see it. I have my code window. In my code window, I have a couple of ways to get code into Lambda. It's really a pain in the butt to work with my code in this inline editor. It's essentially an inline text editor. But for me personally, I'd rather use Atom, and I know some of you are using Atom. I know some of you are also using Visual Studio Code, so you'd prefer Visual Studio Code as opposed to this inline editor. You have that option. So by default, my code's going to get here from this inline editor, and I can use this editor, and we'll start with this. But ultimately, as my applications get more and more complicated, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be building the functions on my local system and then uploading them to Lambda. Okay, and we'll do that today. So right now, we'll start with inline code, but eventually we're going to upload the file from a zip file. And then the process of uploading it from a zip file and uploading the file from S3 is essentially the same thing. What happens, though, is Lambda will not allow me to upload a project that's more than 10 megabytes in size. So if it's more than 10 megabytes in size, I can't upload it as a zip file. I have to upload it to S3 first, and then I can transfer it into Lambda. But the process is essentially the same. Okay. Our runtime, we can change it on the fly if we want to. I wouldn't suggest it. We're just going to deal with Node.js. This handler is kind of important. The way the handler works is the first prefix index is going to be our file name. So we have a file named index.js. So index is the prefix to our handler. And then the .handler is this function. So it's the export statement. What do I export? I'm exporting the handler. So that's kind of like the starting point of my function. So if I wanted to have other functions around, I certainly can. Yeah?
Is that synonymous with a controller function?
Essentially. Yep, the starting point of your application. So if you're in the Java world, we have the main function where your program starts execution. That's the same thing here. It's basically saying, where should I start? So if I have multiple functions, which one should I start with? It's defined here. Okay, so if I change this exports handler to exports ABC, then my handler would be index.abc. Okay, because I have the index file, the index.js file, and I'm exporting ABC, so my handler is index.abc. Okay, it's pretty conventional to call this your handler. Right, and it's conventional because that's the way AWS built it, right? So most people will just kind of leave it as is, but you're welcome to change it. Okay, if we scroll down, so I'm going to change the font back because we're not looking at code anymore. I can set up environment variables. I can tag this. So we've talked about tags in the past with other AWS resources. So the tags are going to allow us to basically have this function. If we're getting billed for the function, who pays for it? What project does it belong to? That type of thing. Our execution role, we talked about it. It created an execution role for us. We skipped over that part. We said, yep, just take care of it for us so we can execute our function. We're not running it in a private cloud. We can basically keep track of all of the trace information, and the Amazon X-ray basically says when did your function start, how long did it take, what happened. So you can trace all of the different micro events that happened to run your function. We can set up concurrency. We can add configurations for it. We can do all sorts of stuff. For the most part, we can ignore all of this stuff. Okay, so we created a function. We haven't really modified it. We said, yep, that's fine. We're going to create a function. We named it. Let's run it. Okay, and before we run it, I want to explain what's going on. So just to be clear, this is our entry point. We have an asynchronous function definition right here. Okay, and this doesn't look like a function definition from the first semester JavaScript class, but the second semester class it does. So what ends up happening is I have a function definition that looks like this. So I have a function definition. It happens to be asynchronous. We're not necessarily dealing with the fact that it's asynchronous right now. So I have this function definition. It takes one incoming parameter, which is an event. I build a constant, which is a JSON object. So I build a JSON object saying the HTTP status code is 200, meaning everything was okay. That's what the HTTP status code is it's okay. And then the body of that JSON is going to be hello from Lambda, so our hello world function. That's what we return, is we return this JSON object that we just built. Okay, so we're not just returning a string, we're returning a JSON object. So we have a JavaScript object that's going to have a status code and a body. Okay, those are the two attributes that we have. I'm ready to run this thing. So I save it. And then I want to test it. But in order to test it, so test it basically means I just want to run it and see how it goes and see if it's working correctly. I want to test it. In order to test it, I have to create a test event. Okay, so I hit test, but I don't have a test event set up. So my event template is hello world, and it's asking me to name my event. So I'm going to call this MATC demo test. In order to execute my function, it expects an HTTP request body. So I have that JSON object there. I'm not doing anything with this data. So right now it's saying, hey, I'm going to send in a key with a value 1, a key with a value 2, and a key with a value 3. So it's sending in 3 key value pairs. I'm ignoring that data right now. Okay, but it's fine that I do pass it in. I'm just ignoring it. Okay, we'll come back to that. Okay, so I'm ready to create my test method. And you'll notice my test method shows up here in the drop-down list. I'm ready to test this. And if all goes well, at the top you'll see that the execution result was that this was successful. And I can go into the details, and you can see that my return value was hello from Lambda. What if I don't want this complicated response? Like I don't want a JSON object, I just want a string hello world. Right? So I close this result back, I come down to the code. I don't really need this JSON object anymore. I'm going to say my response is Cubs stink. Okay, just a plain text string. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to test it. And you'll notice that my output shows up in the details, that the Cubs stink. If I go back to the way it was initially written, all it is a modern JavaScript function. So instead of using the function keyword, we're going to have the fat arrow syntax. So I have parentheses around the incoming parameters. I don't explicitly call it a function, but it is a function because I'm using that fat arrow syntax. So I've modified it now. I can go ahead and save it and test it, and you'll see I get the same exact results. And now you'll notice that I actually got an error. I don't know why I got an error. This looks okay to me. Because I only have one incoming parameter, I don't need parentheses around the incoming parameter. But I don't think that was the issue that it was showing me. So what I think happened, and this has happened to me a ton, is that when I use the inline editor, it doesn't necessarily pick up all my code when I hit save. Like it'll kind of save half of my progress and it won't, like it'll show in the editor what I expected to type. But then what actually executes is not what I typed. It won't have my latest and greatest changes. So like I was telling you, the inline editor is fine to kind of get started, but it's a pain in the butt to actually really work with. Like if I actually have to get some work done and I'm spending 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for a full-time job, then I do not want to be working in the inline editor. Like that's not fun. Okay? So, a more realistic environment of how we would be working, right? So, I'd be building a node application, right? So, I want to work on my file system. Okay, so we've dealt with some of these tools. We have Node installed, we have npm installed, right? So, I can build a node application using those tools that are already on our systems. So, if I come out to my desktop, I'm already on my desktop. And I create a new project folder. So I'm going to call this project folder matc demo. So I'm going to make a new directory called matc demo. And I'm going to change my working directory to matc demo. There's nothing in that folder. So if I do that directory listing, you see there's nothing in the folder. I'm going to use npm init to create a new node package, my package.json file. Okay, it says what's the package name? matc demo is fine, version 1's fine. My description is going to be a matc demo for a Lambda function on AWS. My entry point being index.js, that's great. I'm not setting up a test command or a get repository or keywords or author or anything like that. And I have package.json now in that directory. Okay, so if I do a directory listing, you're seeing package.json there. Now I have a node package and I want to start working in this directory, and it said my entry point was index.js. Now I don't care if you work from a terminal or command prompt. I'm going to go ahead and open up Atom. And I want to create a new index.js file, and I'm going to save it in my desktop in that matc folder as index.js. In order for this to work, I have to say exports handler equal to some function definition, and it's an asynchronous function that takes an event and sends it into this function definition. We'll talk about that event object here in a second. So it's taking one incoming parameter. Again, I'm just going to say, I'm going to create a constant called message equal to Cubs stink from my file system. .zip file. It's not a .zip file yet, but it will be here in a second. And then I'm going to return the message. So I'm just writing my own JavaScript. If I have another function, right, I could have another function. So I'm going to use the first semester JavaScript syntax. And I had a typo anyway, so it's a good thing I did. So my message will equal the result from that function call. Oops. And then I better make sure that I return it down here. This is completely unnecessary, but I just wanted to show you that we can have multiple functions within our file. And because I've defined that handler in Lambda, it knows that the entry point should be this function as opposed to this get message function. Life's good?
You did npm install what in the command line?
So I didn't do any npm installs yet. So all I did is I did npm init to create a project. Yep. And that brings up a good point. So in order to do anything in AWS, in the AWS ecosystem, we saw this when we were connecting to DynamoDB. We use the AWS SDK. So let's assume that I'm going to eventually want to do that. So I'm going to go to my project directory and I'm going to issue a command npm install AWS SDK. And when I do that, it says, hey, there's 14 packages that were added. And what it did is it modified my package.json file, and it then grabbed all of those AWS packages and put them into a folder called node_modules. So now my project is my JavaScript file that I created, and then package.json is indicating that I have a dependency of AWS SDK. And if I look at this in my Finder window, you can see here's the node modules. That was what was installed when I asked to have that dependency of the AWS SDK. I'm not using it in my code. You can see that in Atom. I don't have anything about requiring the AWS SDK, and I'm not using it at all. But it's there if I need it. So if later I want to use the AWS SDK because I want to create a more complicated application or I want to connect to other services, I have it available to me. But it makes my life more complicated about how I bundle this up and move it out to Amazon, and specifically to Lambda. Okay? Let's handle this first. So I have my code in line right now, and I just want to show you what this looks like. Is I'm going to go out to the Finder window, and I'm going to take this project and I'm going to zip it up. So I'm going to take matc demo, I'm right clicking, and there's a compress option on a Mac. There's a send to zip file on Windows. Right, so I'm just compressing this, and I end up with a zip file. This is pretty much how you submit projects in most classes, right? You take the whole folder, zip it up, send it off to Blackboard. Okay, so then I want to say my code entry type is from a zip file. I'm going to upload that package. So I grab that zip file, I open it, and I save. I have to save now because it's modified. Tells me that the deployment package of your Lambda function is too large to enable inline code editing. However, you can still invoke your function. I can't access it through the inline editor anymore. It's fine. I don't really want to anyway. Right? I want to work from my file system. I want to work in Atom. I want to work in Visual Studio Code. Like whatever your preference is, like it doesn't matter to me. I know I don't want to use the inline editor. Okay, so I've uploaded my code. I'm ready to test it. And I get an error eventually. Index.handler is undefined or not exported. That's the error I'm getting, right? Everyone see this error? I was pretty clear that I have an index file and I'm exporting a handler. And when I look at this, what I'd typically do is I'd say, is this the same as what I had before? Right, so I'm going to close the execution log. I'm going to say that I don't want to upload it from a zip file. Yeah. At any rate, I promise you this is the right code. If I go back to that inline editor, this is the code that they had essentially. This is the code that we wrote after we changed it from returning a JSON object that had a status code to now we're just exporting a string message. This code will run. The problem is how I uploaded it. I can't upload the folder. I got to upload the individual files of my project. Okay, so if I go back over to the file system, the problem that I'm having is I just said take this folder and compress it. That's not what I want to do. I want to take these individual files and folders, compress them. I can't grab the parent. So I'm going to select all of these things in the directory. And then I'm going to export those, or I'm going to compress those things. It doesn't matter what the file name is, but I can change it certainly. So if I want to call this my MATC demo. Okay, now I'm going to upload that new version of it, which is the zip file, which is not the parent directory. It's the individual files that I'm compressing and the directories. I'm going to send that up. I'm going to save it. And I'm going to test it.
Is that because when you zip it, it adds like a second layer of like folders, kind of?
So it keeps the folder structure, and that's the problem.
Right.
So it's looking at that parent level and saying, hey, I don't have index.js. I have the folder.
As the root, right?
Yeah. That happened to me about 2 years ago, and I'm like, what the heck is going on? Like, why does this not work? And like eventually there was like a Stack Overflow post that said, you know, this is what's going on. But 2 years ago, this was not simple. So I wanted to make sure you saw it because like my initial reaction would be if I'm going to upload a project, I'm going to take the whole project folder and upload it. You will not have success. And it's really hard to kind of track down what's going on. So I just wanted to make sure you saw it. We can automate all of this. Right? So I could, and again, this is a tough skill, right? So if I do a directory listing right here, I'm just going to remove the zip file. Okay, so I remove the zip file. There is no zip file. It's just my files that I care about. There's a zip command, and I want to do this recursively. So I want the subfolders underneath it. I want to zip up everything in the directory. So from a terminal, I'm saying zip everything recursively. The file name that I want to use for the compressed output, like the result of this zip, is going to be matcdemo.zip. And then I want to zip up everything. So I'm just using the dot to indicate that I want to zip up everything. I executed the command, and now you'll notice there's that matc-demo.zip. Now, we might not think that's very interesting, right? Like, okay, I can zip it from a terminal, but then I can also use the AWS CLI So there's an AWS CLI that will let me deal with Lambda. So I'm just saying AWS Lambda, and I'm just going to hit enter. And I'm going to say AWS Lambda help. And what I'll typically do is there's an update function code method that basically says, okay, I can run that command, AWS Lambda update function code. I pointed it at a zip file, and as long as I've configured the AWS CLI, it'll push that zip file out to Lambda. So my process, like what I'll do is I'll build a build script essentially. I save my files, I work in my editor. So I'm working in Atom, I save my files. And then when I'm ready to deploy this thing, I have a shell script or a batch file that zips up all my files. So you just saw the command that zips up all the files. And then I issue this follow-up command, which is using the AWS CLI to push my code out to Lambda. So I never really go out to the AWS console. I can update my code and push it out to the AWS console without ever touching the AWS console. We can automate that build and deploy process for our Lambda functions. Okay, it's kind of cool. Is that a big deal to be able to automate that? How many of you are in the Java class right now? No one's in the, just one? How do you like having to compile before you can run your code? I think it's such a pain. I watch people build their enterprise Java applications, and they just want to change the HTML, and they have to recompile the whole application to deploy it. And it's like, you can't just see your HTML change. That's not even compiled source code, because it'll be in a JSP file. It's like, so now it's a 5-minute process to change an HTML file. And it's like, I do that 100 times a day. Right? I want to see what it looks like with a list item versus a collection of divs. I want to see what the style looks like. It can't take me 5 minutes to see that change. Like, I got to be a little quicker about how do I make a change and deploy that so I can actually physically see it. So this automated processing, so like eventually we're going to get there. It's continuous integration and continuous deployment. So we'll deal with it in this class. Super important. Like, I mean, that's kind of a building block of starting a project. Like, if I'm going to start a project, I want to know how I'm going to build the project and how I'm going to deploy the project so that I can be efficient doing that. I don't even care what programming language. Show me the environment that I have to work in and how my code ultimately ends up in the production environment, and then I'll work around whatever code we have to deal with. But it's hard, right? Like, there's so many surrounding technologies that we have to deal with. Like, so I'm dealing with a command line, I'm dealing with AWS CLI, I'm dealing with the code, I'm dealing with the AWS ecosystem, I'm dealing with pushing things. So like it's tough. So that's why that CI/CD is a little later in the semester. Okay. Okay. This event object is an important thing. Okay. So instead of getting a message and returning the message, I want to return this event object. I want to see what it is. Right? You should have some natural curiosity, like what's getting passed into my function. Okay, so I save this. I'm ready to repackage this and upload it. So I rezip everything up. I'm going to upload that file. And now I want to test it. So my return value is this event object. Where the heck did that come from? Where do I get this JSON object that has key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2, key 3, value 3? You saw it already today. Yeah, my test, right? That's the data that I passed into the function when I'm trying to test it. So if I go up to my test and I can configure my test events, and I say, you know, here's the team, it's the Cubs, message, Cubs stink, and I'll have a location. That's the data I want to send into my function. What team, what's the message, and where am I sending it from? I save my new test, right? I'm sending in different data, and now I want to run my function. How do I access that stuff? Like if I want Cubs, Cubs stink, MATC. It's JSON data, right? So I have a JSON object right here. That's what's getting passed in. The event is a JSON object. JSON object being a JavaScript object, meaning I can access the team, the message, and the location just using event.team, event.message, and event.location. Okay, so I come back over to my code. I know what the event object is. If I pass in those parameters, I should be able to say, you know, here's the team. I should be able to say, here's the message. And I can get the location. And then what I want to return is some formatted string. Right, so my return value is going to be team. So I'm using a string template here. I guess I'll use the first semester JavaScript kind of format. Team plus, so I'm getting Cubs. My message plus my location. Just concatenating all that together. I was going to put together like some formatted message, but I don't want to do that with just concatenation. Okay, so I save that. And now I come back over to my terminal to compress all of this again. Then I can upload my updated zip file. Save it. My test still has those 3 parameters. And now if I run this, I get an error saying message has already been declared. I screwed up my code because I already had this constant here, and I tried to redefine it. So I'll update it again. Push my updated file out. See how annoying this is to have to push the updated file out? So I compress it, and then I come out here to upload the file. Wouldn't it be nice if it was just one step? I just go back to my terminal, hit the up arrow, and hit enter. It compresses it and pushes it. That's what we're going to do on Thursday. Okay, so for today, I just kind of want to get into this workflow of understanding what everything is around AWS Lambda. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. And then I should be able to test it. So I get my team, which is Cubs. I get my message, Cubs stink. And then I get the location, which is MATC. I've run into, especially when I deal with DynamoDB, my functions will time out because I don't have enough resources allocated to them. So in the basic settings, I can come in and say, if I allocate more memory, then I get less than 1 million requests per month, right? So it's 128 megabytes by default. If I double that to 256 megabytes, then I am able to have 500,000 requests. So I'm running into some things there. I can also increase the timeout window. So maybe you said, I'm going to delete this customer, and you did that through my web application, and now I want to delete that customer's S3 resources. I don't really care how long that takes. It doesn't have to be immediate. If it takes 10 seconds, that's fine. If it takes 8 seconds, that's fine. So I'm updating some of the basic settings. Nothing's really going to change there. It's still going to be successful. I'm still going to get the details about what happened. If I look at my functions, I wanted to get up to this tab, but I wasn't seeing it initially. I can monitor this function to see how much usage I'm getting, to kind of determine, am I going to get billed? So right now there's been 4 invocations. I can look at the log to indicate what actually happened on all of these. So each invocation is going to have a report about when it occurred. If I want, I can clear all these. I want to delete all the recent invocations. I thought I could just delete them. I don't know if I have to do it on an individual item. Yeah, this makes it kind of a pain to see, but they do have timestamps on them. So I can see that this happened at 1:10. So I can sync up when things happened. Over the last 3 hours, over the last 3 days, over a week. I can customize it, so I only want the last minute, last hour, last day. Maybe I'm watching my bill and all of a sudden I see a spike in my bill and I want to see what happened. When did this change? Why is this function getting executed all the time? When did that start happening? Was it a result of some code change that happened? Okay, so I can monitor this. Super important to be able to see. I can delete the function. So if I'm all set, I'm ready to delete the function. I don't like it anymore. It's throwaway. It was just kind of for a demo. I can come through and I can say, yep, clean this up. I can get back in. I can look at the details. These functions are defined within a specific region. Right? I told you that I have existing Lambda functions in US East 1. So you can see these are different functions. Whereas in US East 2, I have different functions, which was our demo here. Why that's important is because if I'm going to create a Dynamo database, I'm going to create it in a specific region. It's going to get replicated across 3 regions over 15 minutes. But there's one region where that DynamoDB exists. Ideally, my functions are going to exist in the same place as all my other AWS resources. They don't have to be. But maybe geographically, I got users that are on the East Coast and the West Coast, so I've set up kind of 2 different environments, right? Maybe my East Coast users hit certain applications harder than my West Coast users. So I have a ton of services on the East Coast and a ton of services on the West Coast. Then I can think about that architecture, right? I don't necessarily want my Lambda functions accessing DynamoDBs that are on the East Coast if my Lambda function's on the West Coast. I can prevent that. Or Like we can even go further and say, oh, one's on the East Coast and then one's in Hong Kong, right? Certainly possible. It will still work. Okay, so that's an important point, is that even if my Lambda function is in one region, and my Dynamo database is in another, and my S3 bucket is in another, they can still talk to each other. It's just going to take longer. And the longer my function executes, the more I'm going to get billed for it. So ideally, all of my AWS resources are going to be in a single region. But AWS will allow you to do whatever you want. Okay, it's a hard problem to solve, right? If it's just a business that's located here in Madison, it's easy. Pick a region and go with it. And you don't know where your users are, but they're going to be US users. So if you deploy it on the East Coast or West Coast or in Ohio, kind of central United States, like you're fine. But if you get into a big organization where you have resources kind of all over the world, then things get more complicated. Is everyone okay with the function definition? So when we go back over to Adam. So just some syntax notes, because we're using this fat arrow, that's a function in JavaScript. And the way I would read it, and if we're more comfortable with this, we can just say that this is a JavaScript function that doesn't have a name, that takes in one parameter, which is event. And at this point, I think the only thing that should look weird is this async. And I know some of you are going to say, hey, this isn't following the first semester coding standards, right? So the first semester coding standards will tell you that this constant should be team, and this message should be message. I think the first semester coding standards are wrong. Like for a JavaScript developer. Like I don't think it's wrong that you have to follow a coding standard. I think that's great. That's the reality, but in the JavaScript world, we use camel case notation. So if it's just one word, it's going to be a lowercase variable, even if it's a constant. I call constants and variables, I use them interchangeably. So they're going to be lowercase. So I think the only thing that should really look weird is this async, right? It's going to cause some problems for us eventually, but for this, right now, all of our code is synchronous. We assign a variable, we assign another variable, and we assign our third variable, we return the results, and there's no time delay. When we get to processing records in DynamoDB, I'm going to say go scan or go query our Dynamo table, and it takes some time to get those results back. What's going to happen is we're going to hit the return statement before those results come back. And we're not going to get the expected results. So we'll have to code around that a little bit too. So you're going to see some JavaScript that you haven't seen, but by all means, just ask about the syntax. What I would suggest, I'm going to make the next lab available, which is a Lambda lab. The Lambda lab is more complicated than what we've gone through. We're setting up a S3 trigger. Basically, the lab does this. So a user uploads an image to an S3 bucket. It triggers a Lambda function. The function's written in Python. I stole the code from the internet. So the function's written in Python. So instead of having our function saying that our runtime is Node, we're going to change our runtime to Python. I give you the code. You don't have to do anything with the code. You're just creating the function. So the user uploads an image to an S3 bucket. It triggers a Lambda function that then creates a thumbnail image of the user uploaded image. So the user uploads a full-size image. It triggers my Lambda function, then resizes it and creates a thumbnail version of that image. So that's really what the lab is doing. I'm going to put it out on Blackboard. You're welcome to kind of look ahead. You're welcome to create other functions. Okay, so if I go back out and I say, I want to create a new function and see what it looks like in Python. Hello world Python. Again, it's going to create the execution role for us. It's going to allow us to run Lambda. I'm going to create the function. See what's similar, see what's different. I don't know Python, but I can read what's going on. It's the same thing that was going on in JavaScript, right? Now I'm just comparing what's the syntax difference. Okay, and you'll notice that I have to define my starting point again. Like, what's the starting point? Well, it's the Lambda function file name. So there is the Lambda function, that's the file name. And then the function name looks like Lambda handler. This looks like a function name to me. That's the starting point. Okay, cool. Now I want to play around with Python a little bit. It's a good place to start. I'll also point out, at this point, we're only dealing with one file. So we've always said, here's how we indicate the file, and then here's the function starting point. Hopefully that leads you to believe that you can have multiple files here. Right? If I'm building a Node application and I want to run it on Lambda, my Node application is going to have multiple files. Right? And I'm guessing the same thing's true of Python. I told you I'm not a Python developer. Same thing with C#. If I want to build a .NET class and then I want to use that class in another file, I can certainly do that. So all this handler is doing is saying what file, what function. Indicating multiple files is just fine. Okay. So Thursday, what I want to do is I want to build that pipeline of I'm going to package my code. So if I make a change, I want to be able to package the code. So I want to zip that up. And then I want to be able to push that out using the AWS CLI. So I want to automate that deployment process. And then the idea is that we will then take our code and start connecting over to DynamoDB. So right now our code is not really doing anything. It's a hello world version of our code. We saw the editor. We saw how we can work in that environment. What I want to do is I want to take that environment. I want to scan our records. So I'm going to continue to use that baseball stats example. And I'm going to be working from here. So I'm working from the AWS console. So we, in the past, had used DynamoDB locally. I'm now going to start using DynamoDB on the AWS services so that my Lambda function can easily connect to it. Okay, so that's the plan for Thursday, is how do we get that data, how do we manage that data, and how do we deal with the data from Dynamo. So I'm going to stop here for today.